few minutes today, and we pray that, Lord, it would become a common practice for us. Lord, in your mercy. I think it's about 9 or 10 weeks ago that we started this fall in early September with a series called Live Like That. And if you remember, the very first Sunday, I put a picture on the screen of Christ the Redeemer statue overlooking Rio de Janeiro. Told you the story of standing at the railing and looking up and wanting to see Jesus, but it was a cloudy day. So we looked during that series of Live Like That at issues of identity, of character, of vocation, believing that through those three things we were following in the footsteps of Jesus. Then the last 4 weeks we've been in a series that we just simply called Freedom. And I don't know if you've put this together, but Freedom series was really about what does it mean? How do we become free of the clouds that get in the way of us seeing Jesus? Well, that's an ongoing process that we're going to continue into the new year. But we start today into a third series this fall, or a third part of really one series for the whole fall, when we want to talk about discerning God's presence. How do we see God? How do we hear Him speak? How do we know Him? And how do we walk and act with Him? I know that when I ask the question, or somebody asks the question from the front often, where have you seen God at work in your life this week? I know what happens inside of us. Oh, shoot, that question again. I don't know. How do you see God at work? I don't know where to see Him. I don't know what that's like. And so we fidget and we put our eyes down and we hope nobody looks at us in case somebody asks us to tell the story. Now I know it's getting better. It's not that bad. But how do we see God at work? That's what we're dealing with today. And there's so many scriptures that we could have looked at, particularly that one Isaiah 6 that we were on Day of Prayer and that we've heard and read this morning and sung about this morning. Craig, I don't think I've ever told you, the first time I ever sung that song, we were in England. And we went into a Pentecostal church to sing that song. It lasted, I'm not kidding, I'm not making this up. We started singing the song. I went for a walk for 20 minutes, came back, they were still singing the same song. They were still trying to see the Lord. I don't know why it took so long, but it's a great song and I want to sing it more and more. I want us to come to the text this morning in John chapter 1, verse 14 to 18. And you'll see on your sheets underneath that section of the persecuted church two versions, the NIV translation and the Message paraphrase. And I would invite maybe one person, if you don't mind coming to the mic so those online can hear you. Could you read the NIV from the mic and then have another person follow in their footsteps reading from the Message? I haven't picked anybody. I'm just going to get two volunteers that feel bold and courageous and how important it is to read the text. Come on up, NIV, and then the Message. Two people, please. Thanks, Cheryl. Somebody follow Cheryl with the Message.
The Word became flesh and made His dwelling among us. We have seen His glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. John testified concerning Him. He cried out, saying, "This is the one I spoke about when I said, 'He who comes after me has surpassed me because He was before me.' Out of His fullness we have all received grace in the place of grace already given. For the law was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God but the one and only Son, who is Himself God and is a closest relationship with the Father, has made Him known."
The Word became flesh and blood and moved into the neighborhood. We saw the glory with our own eyes, the one-of-a-kind glory, like Father, like Son, generous inside and out, true from start to finish. John pointed Him out and called, "This is the one I told you was coming after me, but in fact was ahead of me. He has always been ahead of me, has always had the first word. We all live off his generous abundance, gift after gift after gift. We got the basics from Moses, and then this exuberant giving and receiving, this endless knowing and understanding. All this came through Jesus, the Messiah. No one has ever seen God, not so much as a glimpse. This one-of-a-kind God expression, who exists at the very heart of the Father, has made him plain as day.
I tell you, Eugene Peterson's version is such a gift to us, isn't it? Has made him as plain as day. This one-of-a-kind gift. Come with me to verse 14 because we're only looking at one verse today. The texts are there. Flip your page over. You'll see a bit of an outline. Would love you to grab your pens, circle stuff on the text, write stuff down as you hear not just me speak it, but hopefully the Lord whispering to you. And let's try this today. It worked semi-well at Robson Park in our first gathering. Would you interrupt me? Would you answer when I ask questions? Would you, every once in a while, yell a loud amen? Do something that just involves us, because I want this not to be so much a preach at you today, but I want us to dive into this. There's so much fun stuff here. We could be here till 2. We won't. But let's just dive in for a few minutes and see what John has written to us. The Word became flesh. Well, let's just take the first half. And let's land there for a minute. The Word, what is he talking about? One of the commentators says, this verse may be the most important verse in all the Bible. Now, I don't know how you do that. I don't know how you pick one out of all the rest and say it's the most important. But you get the point. There's something really crucial in this verse. Something that we need to know and we better hang on to. You see, in the Greek world, the word logos, the word, was all about this deep sense of wisdom and knowledge, and somehow you could almost attain to a higher way of living if you had this knowledge. There's a truth, and they had it. But the Jews come along, and in their culture, God is using this word as a self-expression. Here's my son. He is the Word. He is wisdom. He is the one who is above all. He is the one who has come, who I have sent to reveal myself. See, God revealed himself in the Word at creation. He accomplished all that he intended. He revealed himself when Moses came down the mountain with the 2 tablets containing the Word, the 10 Commandments, the Decalogue. And here in John chapter 1, you go back to the very first verse, and what do you see? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. John is saying all that the Greeks were searching for in wisdom, in knowledge, human knowledge, God has revealed that that's who he is through the Word. Friends, if God reveals his identity, his character, his vocation to us, and then makes us in his image, what does that practically mean for us? 2 things. We pay attention to where God's revealing himself, and we bear witness in the way that we live. The Word. But then he goes on. Here's a second touch point, second place where we touch down. The Word became flesh and blood. Love the way Eugene Peterson puts it. Love that he carries that blood in there, not just the flesh. What's John getting at here? Well, 2 things again he's getting at just by adding this little phrase, became flesh and blood. What does it tell us? It tells us that God became human in the person of Jesus. Not just that he appeared like a human, but he appeared as a human. So important for us that Christ, the Messiah, God incarnate, came as a human being. Friends, we don't have to say, well, he was partially human. He was fully human, and that's so totally crucial when we talk about seeing Jesus. My friend Alan Hirsch says it's not just that Jesus looks like the Father, but the Father looks like Jesus. For when we see Jesus, we see the Father. That's what Jesus said to Philip, the disciple. Do you remember? Jesus, just show us the Father and everything will be good. Oh, Philip, when you see me, Jesus said, you see the Father. But there's another side to this. In the fact that Jesus became flesh and blood, yes, he became fully human, but we also can't let go of his divinity. He was fully human, fully divine. That's what John's pushing on us here. That's what he's trying to teach us. We could skip to Philippians chapter 2. Do you remember the hymn that Paul writes? He humbled himself, took on human flesh, became made in the likeness of human beings, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, right? That Jesus humbled himself. Listen to that again. Did not consider equality with God something to be grasped. He was God. And yet he didn't take the posture of saying, well, look at me, look who I am. There was a sense of him glorifying the Father by becoming human. We need to know that he was 100% human, for he identifies with us, understands all of our trials and temptations. But we need to know he's divine also, for he's worthy to be able to forgive our sin. The Word became flesh and blood. Gang, we could have spent an hour and a half just on that, but it gets better even now. Listen to where he goes from here. Then he says, and pitched his tent among us. At least that's how Eugene Peterson puts it. And I actually think he's closer to the truth than all the other translations that leave out the tent bit. Here's why. Follow along with me and see what happens here. In the Old Testament, just go back in your minds for a minute. Where was the presence of God known to be found? Shout it out. In the tent of meeting or the tabernacle. Yeah, where else, Jim? In the temple, right? So let me just say it simply, in the temple or in the tabernacle. Now, temple, where was the temple? In Jerusalem, right? So every single time the Jews are taken away in captivity, what are they longing to do? They're longing to go home. Why are they longing to go home? Because that's where God is. That's where his presence is. That's where we can see him. Well, we can't see him, but one priest once a year can go see him. But the tabernacle, when was the tabernacle part of the Jewish story? Do you remember? Yeah, there it is. They're coming out of Egypt. God's leading them to life in a new and promised land. And he says, I need a place to be. And so they make a tabernacle. And you read through the Old Testament and you see all the various ways in which they're supposed to craft this thing. And where did the tabernacle get placed when it comes to relationship to the whole camp of the millions of Jews that there were there? Where was it? Smack dab in the middle. And who could go there? Not quite, Jim. Close. Everyone could gather and see it, but only the Levites could go closer. And you were right when you said tent of meeting. Only Moses could go into the tent of meeting where God's presence was. So John says that the Word became flesh and pitched his tent among us. Okay, think it through. What are the Jews hearing when John says this? What are they hearing? They know this picture. God has already pitched his tent. But where did he pitch it? Smack dab in the middle. And who could go there? Only a few. So now what's he saying? John's saying, I know, you've seen this. You've seen this scene before. But it's not now that God's contained in the Holy of Holies or in the tent of meeting in the tabernacle, which only a few of you can get close to. Where is he? He's right among us. He's pitched his tent on your street, on my street, down the road, right on the corner. He's not in some special building where no one can go. What do we do with this? Well, we learn that we don't say, I go to church. That's old school stuff, gang. That's believing that God hides himself in some place that only a few have access to. And God said, that's not where you'll see me. You'll see me on every street corner where people are, because I'm pitching my tent amongst you. And what is a disciple? It's not somebody who shows up at church because they believe God's present at church, in the building. It's someone who's learning to pay attention to noticing where God's presence is in and amongst them. Can I say that part again? Disciple is not somebody who shows up in a church building on Sunday. A disciple is someone who's learning to be able to articulate and point to where God is present in the neighborhood day after day after day after day after day. That's what John's saying. We'll come a bit further. There's more, even more in verse 14. For he says, we have seen his glory. The glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. Okay, there's so much there. Pause, stop. What does glory mean? What is that? Can you see it? Do you have a picture in your mind? What is God's glory? See, what John is saying to us is not that, well, if somebody came in here today and said, I saw Jesus Christ walking down Kingsway, walked around Waves and up to Edmonds, you know what we'd say, right? Yeah, we better take you to a doctor tomorrow. There's some stuff that needs fixing. Is it possible? Of course it's possible. Is it likely? No. But when we start to talk about seeing God, this is what John's saying to us here. We're seeing his glory. What is that? It's his radiance. It's evidence of the fact that he's present. And even though we might not see him fully with our eyes, we know he's present because we can see the impact, the results, the radiance. Moses comes down the mountain from the 10 Commandments. What did the people say to him? Moses, put something on your face. We can't even look at you. You're just beaming. You're glowing. Why? Because he'd been in the presence of God. Isaiah goes in the temple. And what does he say? He gets this vision of God, Jesus seated on the throne. And you just sang it. The whole earth is filled with his glory. What did it mean? It mean this was so radiant that his radiance, his glory just was everywhere. You could see evidence all over the place. John says it in Revelation chapter 4, Revelation chapter 5, but he says it right here in chapter 1, verse 14. We have seen his glory. Jesus is his glory, the one and only Son who reflects the Father, revealed by the Father, reflecting the Father. See, God doesn't want anything more for us than for us to be able to see evidence that he's present. Those of you who have had little children, do you remember playing hide and go seek with your kids? Remember when they're 3 or 4, 5 or 6 even, they're playing hide and go seek, and you know what happens? When we go hide, when the parents go hide, you have to be really careful because you could be hidden for like 3-4 hours, right? Like it's pretty tough. They can't always find you, even though you're just behind the couch. But when they go hide, I know this is how it went. Ready or not, here I come. I'm looking for you. Where are you? I wonder if I can see you. You know full well where they are. You can almost see their foot sticking out somewhere. And you just know where they are, but you pretend as if somehow you don't see them. Until what inevitably happened next? They jump out from where they're hiding. I'm here, I'm here, I'm here. Gang, this is what John's saying about the Father. I'm here, I'm here, I'm here. I want you to see me. John says we've seen his glory. We've seen evidence that the Son who was revealed by the Father has come and shown us who the Father is. Why does he say grace and truth? Full of grace and truth. What's that about? I think this was my favorite part. When you go back to Exodus chapter 33, there's a story of Moses. You see it in the study guide this week. We go into the story of Moses, who God's promised to send him into the promised land. And Moses comes in his relationship with God. He comes back to God and he says, don't send us unless you go. We can't go without you. It'll be fruitless. And then in the midst of his relationship with God, he says, come on, God, I want to see you. I just want to see you. And how does God respond? Oh, Moses, you can't. If you looked at me, you would be consumed by fire. It's too bright. But what I'll do is I'll put you in the cleft of this rock. I'll walk past and I'll allow you to see the radiance from the glory of my back. Friends, the words he uses in the Old Testament when talking to Moses is grace and truth. Those are the Hebrew words. What's John doing? John's saying, you remember Moses? Moses saw his back and the radiance. He's done the same thing for us. We've seen the same thing. It's not Moses was some superstar and we don't get this. No, we too get to see God. We've seen his glory. Now let me ask you a quick question before I move to a close. Why is John doing all of this in chapter 1? This sounds to me more like the climax of his story. This sounds to me like at the end, right? This is a prelude. This is, I've written the whole thing. Now I'm coming back to the beginning and I'm giving you verse 1 to 18 as a glimpse, as an executive summary, as an opening, so that here's what I'm going to tell you for the next 21 chapters. We've seen God's glory in his Son as he did miracles of turning water into wine. We've seen God's glory in his Son as he's meeting the woman at the well, as he's calling and making disciples, as he's dealing with religious leaders, as he's teaching in our synagogues and in the courtyards, as he's making a community of oneness between God and his people. We've seen his glory. And we've seen his glory in the breaking of bread and the serving of communion. Jesus reveals the Father. When John says we have seen his glory, he's meaning two things for us. He's meaning the only way that you truly worship is not when you're singing songs that create emotions. Nothing wrong with singing, nothing wrong with emotions. But true worship is when we are telling the stories of where we have seen God. That's what he's saying. We come on a Sunday to gather. We gather together on a Wednesday. Whenever else we gather to be able to say, brothers and sisters, this is where I saw Jesus this week. Therefore, let's sing. This is where I saw Jesus, therefore, let's celebrate. Worship is the telling of stories, the crying of glory, not just the singing about it. Secondly, he says, we've seen his glory, which means we cannot contain ourselves. We must give it away. We must tell others of where we've seen it. I need to close. Can I give you 5 things? We're still stuck with the question of how do we know how to see God when we ask the question? There's so much there in verse 14 that I hope you caught glimpses. But let me give you 5 practical things. 5 practices that I think help us. We'll do this in a minute. We practice obedience. When you are disobedient, you are turned away from Jesus. You cannot see him when you're turned away. When we practice obedience, we're turned towards. Our eyes become open. Secondly, we practice being present in our neighborhoods. Jesus pitched his tent right in our neighborhood. He's present. Let's go find him. Thirdly, we practice seeing Jesus by being with the least of these. The least, the last, the lost, the lonely. Jesus is for them. He's present with them. He's present with those who have been cast out from the norms of society. Why? Because he loved them. When we sit with those who are ostracized, we have a great chance of seeing Jesus. Fourthly, we see Jesus when we practice being in community. Isn't it so much easier to see Jesus in another than it is in ourselves? We need each other to be able to point out where Jesus is at work. We need to fulfill the promise of where 2 or 3 are gathered, there Jesus is present. We need to hear Jesus' words when he says to us that he will tabernacle. Remember what that word means? Pitch his tent in the praises of his people. Lastly, and we're moving to the communion table with this one, we see Jesus when we practice communion. I am so glad that we have made a move to practicing communion every single time we gather. For Jesus says, when I break the bread and offer you the cup, I'm present. Open your eyes and see. I'm going to invite you to take communion at your table. Would you have somebody pass the bread? Each of you have it. Have somebody pray. If somebody needs prayer for something, share that at the table and pray. We're a community of God's people. Then pass the cup. Have somebody pray for the cup. If somebody needs forgiveness, gather around and pray for their forgiveness. We'll give you a couple minutes, and then Craig's going to come and lead us in 1.5 closing songs.